Hello, my name is Nathaniel Brown, and this is my senior thesis project about Jack Redford's Variations on the Incarnation, looking back and forward with piano theme and variations. This project will trace the development of theme and variations in piano literature, as well as analyze Jack Redford's Variations of the Incarnation piece, and then this project will culminate with a performance of Redford's Variations on the Incarnation. A little bit about the origin and genesis of this project. I was fortunate enough to attend the world premiere of this piece in Houston, Texas on July 27, 2023. I happened to sit next to the composer Jack Redford in the audience just by accident. And my first exposure to this piece was actually a couple weeks prior to that premiere performance, where I was serving as camp counselor for the Lead Center Piano Academy, and I got to witness Dr. Paul Barnes give a workshop on how he and Jack Redford collaborated in the development of this piece, and hear how Redford took inspiration from the Handel-Chaconne theme, which this piece is based on, and hear his composition process and how he composed and thought about this piece, which really inspired me to dig deep, to play it, and research a lot about it, and that inspired this whole project. So now I will trace the development of theme and variations in piano literature, starting with Handel and then progressing all the way through Webern. The first piece is George Friedrich Handel's Chaconne in G Major HWV 435. This piece presents an 8-bar theme, which is based on a patterned bass line across each variation, and then the variation comes from this bass line, and the harmonies and the chord progressions, not actually the melody. So the whole Chaconne is based off of this pattern. So that's the bass line with the chordal accompaniment above, and that's what Handel uses to vary throughout this whole Chaconne. The way Handel groups there's 21 variations, and so the way Handel groups each variation is by textural inversion, and he pairs them up with inverting the melodic material and the harmonic material in between the hands. So you can see the eighth notes that are in variation 1 that are in the right hand, then transfer into the left hand in the second variation, and you can see that textural inversion, the swapping of material between the two hands. That's how he pairs each variation. In the first 6 variations, or the first 3 pairs of variations, Handel uses a technique called rhythmic diminution, where he's shortening the accompaniment value of the notes. So you can see in the variation 1, he's using 8 notes, or 2 notes per beat, and then in the third variation, he switches to 3 notes per beat, and then variation 5, you can see 4 notes per beat and 16th notes. So it's going from 8th notes, triplets, and then to 16th notes, shortening that accompaniment rhythmic value, which is rhythmic diminution. And you'll see a lot of examples like that further on. Another common technique with rhythmic diminution is a key change. A lot of composers will take the major sound and then just move to the parallel minor. And that's a nice, easy way to get a different character and a different feeling for a variation by just switching between the parallel major and minor keys. A lot of future composers will use parallel minor. Some will use relative, but a lot of times you'll see parallel minor. After Handel, we move on to Bach, another composer from the Baroque era. I've chosen to analyze his Goldberg Variations, BWV 988. Similarly to Handel, this features another ground bass variation, where, again, it's not the melodic material that's getting varied, but the actual bass line and the chordal accompaniment that sets the tone for the rest of the 30 variations in this piece. Interestingly enough, the first 8 measures actually has the same bass line as Handel. It's the exact same 8 chords, except for the 6th measure where Bach uses a different chord than Handel did. In the 30 variations that Bach uses in the Goldberg Variations, he introduces this structural pattern where, starting at the third variation, each third variation is a canon based on an increasing interval. So variation 3 is a canon at the unison, variation 6 moves to the second, variation 9 to the third, and so on up until variation 27 at the ninth. After each canon, there is a different genre piece. Bach uses many different genres consisting of Baroque dances like sarabans and allemans and courants and stuff like that. He also uses French overtures, that is variation 16 at exactly the halfway point of the piece, where that uses scalar runs and dotted rhythms and very, very characteristic of a French overture. After each genre piece, he also incorporates an arabesque type variation with lots of fast scalar technical passages, and these variations feature lots of hand crossing through. You'll see the left hand jump over whatever the right hand's playing. And so that's how Bach chooses to structure his Goldberg variations, with that canon genre arabesque pattern. One of the genre pieces that he uses is actually a fugue, very common in the Baroque era, in his 10th variation. You can see just that fugue there. You will see a couple more examples of fugues, specifically in Beethoven and Brahms, as those composers are often looking back towards the Baroque era, and specifically Bach with fugues. A lot of composers are actually looking back, similarly with Bach, looking at that Handel first 8 bars matching his Chaconne. The 30th variation in the Goldberg Variations would actually be expected to be a variation at a canon at the 10th, considering 27th was the 9th, and then you'd expect the 30th to be at the 10th. But Bach actually incorporates a quadlibet, which mashes up a couple different folk tunes from the era. You can see the 2 different folk tunes he uses highlighted in blue and orange here, just kind of overlapping and overlaying those 2 melodies on top of each other right before, as the last variation. Right before he actually signals to go and play the aria again after all 30 variations have concluded. This is common with theme and variations. You'll see composers try to figure out how to end their pieces when, after so many variations, that the thematic material is kind of so far removed from the listener's ear. One example, and Bach is incorporating this technique of just referencing or literally playing the aria theme one more time at the very end of the piece. And we'll see how other composers choose to end theme and variations, because there's a couple different methods that are traced here. Moving out of the Baroque era and into the classical era with Mozart, we're going to look at his Sonata in A major, K331, Andante Grazioso, where this actually is a Siciliano theme. You can hear the dotted rhythms in the compound meter. So in this Siciliano, we'll see other composers use Siciliano variations, compound meters, and dotted rhythms in Siciliano. It's also interesting to note that while this is a sonata piece, the first movement of this sonata is a theme and variations, and it's not the typical sonata like reform with your primary and secondary themes and your exposition, moving to the development and the recapitulation. This is showing a growth in the popularity of theme and variations form as it's penetrating into sonata movements in this Mozart example. Similarly with what we saw with Handel, Mozart is also using rhythmic diminution here. You can see in variation 1, he's using 16th notes. Variation 2, he shortens it to 16th note triplets. And then in the 5th variation, the slower one, he's using the 32nd note. So 2, 3, and then 4 notes per beat, just like what Handel did. Again, with Handel, we saw rhythmic diminution, and then we also saw a parallel mode shift. So Mozart is going from A major, and then to A minor. Very easy way to get a new character, a new feeling, like I said. So common technique, we'll see a lot more parallel minor variations. The 4th variation in this Mozart example is, again, looking back to Bach, where he's using that hand crossing technique from the Goldberg Arabesque variations. So you can see highlighted in blue when it's the left hand in the bass, and then yellow is when it jumps over. So just like Bach in the variation 5, Mozart is doing that same technique in his 4th variation. Because the theme of this Mozart theme and variations, first movement of the sonata, is a Siciliano, which is in a compound meter, a lot of composers will shift the meter, they'll change their meter, and because Mozart's going from a compound meter, he has to change it into a simple meter. with 2 notes per beat instead of 3 notes per beat. A lot of composers who have simple meter themes will actually change their meter into a compound meter, and that's where it gets the Siciliano variation title. So Mozart has to do the opposite since he started with the Siciliano theme. The other interesting thing about this 6th variation is that it's an extended variation. So the theme and every variation leading up to this was actually in a rounded binary form with an A section of 8 bars, and then the B section was 10 bars. But this 6th variation in Mozart's sonata actually extends that 10-bar B section. So that's another method that composers use to end their theme and variation. Sometimes they reference back to the theme, like we saw with Bach, and sometimes they will extend their final variation. We'll see one more example in these next composers about how a third method that they use to sort of end their pieces. Moving on to Beethoven, Variations in Fugue for Piano in E flat, Opus 35, Eroica. This actually gets the name Eroica because this bass line and thematic material is exactly what Beethoven used just about a year later in his 3rd symphony. So he's using the same material in this piano variations and then in his orchestral symphony. So this actually doesn't start with the thematic material, though, as we've seen so far. It actually presents an introduction, which is only the ground bass line. So yeah, and he actually varies this a couple times. He adds in more voices before we actually get to the theme. There's actually a 2-voice and then a 3-voice and then a 4-voice addition onto this bass line, and then you'll finally hear the theme. Where it starts that arpeggiation. Beethoven also is using rhythmic diminution. You can see the 16th notes moving to the triplet 16th notes. So again, we're shortening that accompaniment rhythm as the themes progress. Beethoven is looking back to Bach in this example. He's referencing the canons that he used in the Goldberg Variations. The example above is variation 3 from the Goldberg Variations, the canon at the unison, each voice highlighted in green and yellow, and then you can see below Beethoven's canon at the octave in his 7th variation, with those 2 voices highlighted in green and yellow. So you can see the interplay. And again, Beethoven is looking back to Bach and using examples from earlier. Like we saw with Handel, there's textural inversion. So this bass line, he now puts in the top voice and he puts the melody in the bottom voice. So now that is in the top. This is also another key change into a parallel minor, moving from E flat major into E flat minor. Super common to use those parallel mode shifts. Beethoven also uses a Siciliano variation. Like I said, he's got a simple meter theme, and so he changes the meter into a compound 6/8. He also, similar to how Mozart's final variation was extended to end the piece, he starts extending this, this 15th variation here. And you can see in that extension, it's marked with a coda, and that coda actually features a relative minor. So we're in E flat major, and then the relative minor would be C minor. So he's featuring that theme, a broken up theme in the C minor key in the coda. But that final variation is extended, but this piece actually ends with a fugue, which is the 3rd way that I will discuss how theme and variation pieces end. Beethoven is basing that fugue off of that bass line, and that's how he chooses to end the piece, with a very virtuosic and grand fugue. The other Beethoven piece is 32 variations in C minor without opus 80. Just like Handel, this piece references Handel immensely. So you'll see an 8-bar ground bass theme. Yeah, so that's the chord progression and the bass line pattern with that, just like Handel. 8 bars, super short. He's also grouping variations the same way Handel did. You can see the 16th note arpeggiations in the right hand, and then variation 2, they move it to the left hand, and then variation 3, both hands feature the arpeggiations. This is the exact same technique that Handel ended his Chaconne in his last 3 variations with 16th notes swapping between the hands and then playing them together. So again, looking back to Handel very clearly. Here's another example of that textural inversion grouping of his variations, this growling 30-second note pattern, and then the syncopated right hand octaves, and then you can see in the subsequent variation, those textures just swap between the hands. And then no fugue, but the way Beethoven ends this theme in variations is with a grand extended variation. This is much extended past the 8-bar theme that was presented at the beginning. You can actually see in the middle of the second page, he actually introduces the original bass line and chord progression. Yeah, so that comes back, and that's another way that he's extending the variation, but he's also referencing again to that thematic material, like Bach and like all the variations that were extended. Moving on to Brahms, Variations in Fugue on a Theme by Handel, Opus 24. Brahms is, again, looking back to Handel very clearly, by directly taking his harpsichord suite number 1 in B flat major HWV 434 and using that as the basis for his theme. And you can see that aria presented. Yeah, and so he's using that as his theme, and that's what he chooses to vary. Brahms groups his variations in either a technical or a rhythmic aspect. So you can see an example here of a rhythmic variation where, rhythmic grouping, where he's taking the 8th note to 16th note pattern, yum, ba ba bum, ba ba bum, and that's how he's grouping his 2 variations, his variations 7 and 8. Brahms is doing something very interesting that Redford also will build on later, harmonic foreshadowing. Brahms' 5th variation presents in B flat minor, which is another example of a parallel minor variation. And throughout the first 4 variations, he's slowly incorporating more of a reference to B flat minor as he's transitioning from the major to the minor. So you can see here the end of the 4th variation where it's just littered with tons of B flat minor, D flats and G flats and A flats, and that's really setting up the listener's ear for the new modality shift, the new mode shift there. Looking back to Bach, clearly another canon, this one also at the octave, so looking back to Beethoven and his Eroica, and then looking back to Bach again. All these composers are looking back to each other. And then this is another example in the Brahms piece of the Siciliano variation. You can see the 12/8 compound meter with the dotted rhythms, and our melody, our theme is actually in the inner voice with that F. And then Brahms ends this one similar to Beethoven with a grand fugue. This is how he's choosing to end his piece, with a fugue. Very common looking back to Baroque. The fugue is based off of the sort of ascending, so the aria. So, sort of that ascending seconds of the scale. And that's what Brahms is choosing to base that fugal theme off of. The final composer is Webern, looking at his variations for piano, Opus 27, just the 3rd movement of this piece. Despite its title, only the 3rd movement is actually a theme in variations. The 1st movement is in ternary, and then the 2nd movement is in binary form. Webern is a 2nd Viennese school composer, so he's writing atonally, which means this piece is based off of a tone row. And you can see the matrix that I've made to help you analyze this piece and find all of the row examples. So yeah, that tone row actually features sort of this hexachordal combinatoriality that's with the first 6 notes all half steps apart from each other, and then the second 6 notes are also grouped in those 6 half steps. So super interesting row that Webern loves to do, as he's a total serialism composer. But yeah, looking at his theme and variations though, he's doing this new technique that wasn't seen before. Every composer up to now has made clear delineations in the structure of their pieces of this is the variation, and this is where it starts, and this is where it ends, and oftentimes there'll be repeat signs or brackets or titles, variation, number. Webern doesn't do that. All of the colors and labels are actually my additions in the score as I was analyzing this, and so Webern actually links together his variations and obscures the beginnings and ends of them. He's using a lot of overlapping pitches in between rows. You can see here the end of the 2nd variation ends with R1. which ends on a C natural and an E natural. And I9 starts on a C natural and an E natural, and that's where the third variation starts. So the second variation hasn't culminated quite yet, but the third variation has already started on that I9 as we're waiting for R1 to end. So he's linking and obscuring the structure and the form of this piece, and that's something Redford does a little bit. Webern also is grouping his variations. So you can see he's grouping his variations based off of the number of rows present in each variation. So the first and fourth each have 7 rows in them, and then the second and third each have 5. The theme has 3, and the fifth actually doubles 3. So there's another connection there. More on the fifth connecting to the first. The fifth is the last variation. So similar to how Bach was referencing directly the theme, Webern is also referencing the beginning of his third movement in the theme by using the same row forms that was in the theme. So you can see that's P0, I0, and R0 that were in the theme, and he's also using those same 3 rows in his fifth variation, and that is him referencing back to the theme to give that piece in it. So now moving on to Jack Redford's variations on the Incarnation. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the journey and the structure of this piece. At the performance in Houston, there was actually program notes with a story about Jack Redford and how he sort of visualized the journey of this piece, which I will read to you now. The text prompted references to ancient Christian spirituality within the music itself. The introduction, interlude, and conclusion are made up of 3 essential phrases echoing Trinitarian thought. The first descends in resonance with the condescension of God becoming man in the Incarnation. The second ascends in harmony with the resurrection and ascension of Christ, and the third descends again, as does the New Jerusalem at the ultimate restoration of all things. The first 3 variations unfold, as does life and ministry of Jesus, with increasing complexity. The fourth may be heard as accompaniment to the first, Holy Thursday, which Christ spent with his disciples in the upper room on the eve of his crucifixion, and during which he washed their feet, taught them about the depths of love, and introduced the Eucharist. The Furioso reflects the violence of Good Friday, the stillness of its refrains and numbness of Holy Saturday, and the triumphal 6th variation, the glory of Easter. So in this piece, he's sort of taking you through the journey of Christ and its ascension and condescension into man with Jesus' birth, and then Good Friday all the way up until Easter. So that's sort of the story with each variation. He mentioned this Trinitarian aspect, and so I'm going to refer to this as a Trinitarian doctrine, where this piece is very strongly based on 3. The theme is mostly felt in a triple meter. He's got an introduction, interlude, and coda, which are 3 parts, each with 3 phrases, nonetheless. And he groups his 6 variations into 2 groups of 3. And the groups are separated by the interlude, which is part of that introduction, interlude, coda trio group. The theme is based off of the Greek Orthodox Pentakion hymn on the Nativity of Christ, written by St. Romanos the Melodist in the 6th century. You can see the first words in the Greek chant, and then the translation underneath in English, "Today the Virgin gives birth." The entire text translation translates to, "Today the Virgin gives birth to the transcendent one, and the earth presents a cave to the unapproachable one. Angels with shepherds give him glory, wise men follow a star as they journey to him, who is God from all ages, yet for our sake was born as a little child." Now I'll be looking at all of the devices in Theme and Variations piece that Redford wrote, and how all of these examples can be found in previous composers' pieces, and how Redford is looking back to all of those. Redford's piece begins with an introduction, not the thematic material. That's an example that we saw in the Beethoven Opus 35, where he starts with that bass line, and now Redford is using that initial phrase, which he said descends to represent the condescension of God into man. More on that theme, it's an outside material piece, which we saw Bach use in his quadlibet with those 2 folk tunes, and then Brahms' theme was also based on Handel's harpsichord suite. So these composers are taking outside material and using that as the basis for their theme variations. Redford uses that Trinitarian doctrine, like I mentioned, to organize his whole piece: introduction, interlude, and coda, separating the 2 groups of 3 variations. Handel was using grouping variations with textural inversion, which also was seen in the Beethoven Opus 80. Bach had that strong structure of canon, genre, and arabesque. Brahms was using textures or rhythms, and then Webern was using the number of rows. So very different ways to sort of group variations together, but all grouping variations to sort of create a coherent piece. The first three variations in Redford also use rhythmic diminution. So the beginning is in quarter notes. It then goes on to eighth notes. And then the third variation was 16th notes. So yeah, each having the note values of the accompanimental rhythm. And then in that second and third variation, you could hear that the melody was in the right hand, and then the melody was in the left hand, or the theme was in the left hand. So that's an example of textural inversion. Handel did that to group all of his variations, and we saw that with the Beethoven, with the bass line in the top voice. Textural inversion. The fourth variation that Redford uses is actually a Siciliano. We saw that initially with the Mozart, but this 12/8 compound dotted rhythm feel. So that's the Siciliano variation, which we saw in Beethoven and Brahms, and of course with the Mozart. That fourth variation, the Siciliano variation, is not in the tonic key of F, but it's actually a chromatic median to way in A flat. Similar to Brahms, foreshadowing that B flat minor fifth variation, Redford is harmonically foreshadowing that fourth variation. You can hear examples in the first, second, and third variation. All these examples end on that big A flat chord, just getting that in your ear. Interestingly enough, even after the fourth variation, there is still echoes of that A flat key. You can see in the fifth variation, it's very disguised, but there's a descending A flat scale. And then in the sixth variation, it's all just A flat, which again, as I mentioned, is a chromatic median to way, which is another interesting relationship with Redford's choice of keys. Not once does he use a relative or a parallel minor key. He's using chromatic medians. With all the previous composers, we saw either minor keys in the parallel or the relatives, but Redford is using chromatic medians, and in the fifth variation, he presents it in D major. The theme is in F, and then Siciliano is in A flat. Redford is also using transitions to link his variations, similar to what Webern did with his overlapping. Here you can see the end of the first variation. And then an eighth note transitional passage. Before we get into the theme. And then I played it earlier, the same thing happens in the before the fourth variation, and actually the third as well, with a brief 16th note passage. Before you get into the third variation. The way Redford is ending his piece is, he doesn't reference the theme, similar to what Bach did and what Webern did, but he's actually referencing the beginning with the introduction. So the coda material has the same melodic material as the intro. Similarly, with the introduction material, it's still based on that Trinitarian doctrine by the outer voices being in thirds. And they're descending in parallel thirds. So lots of third relationships. So Redford is using a lot of these devices in his own composition as, as ways of looking back to previous composers, as Beethoven and Brahms were looking back to Bach, Mozart was looking back to Bach, and Bach was looking to Handel, Beethoven was looking, everyone's looking back in this theme and variations. And Redford is also looking back. He's also looking forward with his new chromatic median relationships instead of the parallel or relative minor keys. Inside of the second and third variations with the 8th notes and 16th notes, he's using new forms of scales like Lydian modes and pentatonic scales, using those new sounds, and the first variation is using all these new chromatic harmonizations of the theme. So it's a way of looking forward as well as referencing back to previous composers. So as for what future theme and variations could look like, that's really up for the next generation of composers to decide, and anyone beyond Redford who's continuing to write theme and variations, as I'm sure other composers will. But who knows what the future of the genre could look like. But next, you will have a quick transitional passage in the video, and then you will hear the variations on the Incarnation by Jack.